Hello and welcome to this tutorial on language and psychopathology from an RFT perspective. So this tutorial is adapted from the first part of Chapter 2 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. You can find other resources on the clinical applications of RFT at languageasintervention.com. In this tutorial, we will learn about problems linked to a lack of fluency and flexibility in relational framing, problems linked to experiential avoidance, and problems linked to persistence. So first I want to remind you of the definition of language in RFT because it will be central to understanding how we approach psychopathology from this perspective. So as we saw in our first two tutorials, language is the learned behavior of building and responding to symbolic relations. There are different areas where language is involved in psychological problems. There are problems linked to the flexibility and fluency of relational framing, problems linked to experiential avoidance, problems linked to rule following and ineffective persistence, problems linked to sense-making and coherence, and problems linked to motivation. In this tutorial, we will cover the first three kinds of problems, and in the next tutorial, we will talk about the last two kinds. The first way psychological problems can arise is because the ability to build and derive relations is not well established. As we saw in a previous tutorial, there are different ways of building and deriving symbolic relations, such as coordination, comparison, distinction, etc. Some are very basic, like coordination, and are the first we learn when we begin to use language. That's because coordination allows us to name things. So when a child learns to name her toys, for example, she begins to build and derive relations of coordination. Some are more complex and require a higher level of abstraction, like relations of hierarchy and relation of perspective, so they are learned later. In some cases, like in developmental disorders, dementia or brain injury, the ability to build and derive symbolic relations is impaired. For example, we know that people with autism and with schizophrenia tend to struggle with perspective taking, which is approached through the concept of deictic framing in RFT. They have more difficulty than non-clinical populations to imagine what it's like to be in the shoes of somebody else, which means, in RFT terms, to derive symbolic networks such as, you just lost a friend, and if I were you, I would feel sad. As a result, it is more difficult for people with schizophrenia and autism to be socially adjusted and to enjoy social interactions. In more severe cases, we can see kids with developmental disorders struggle so much with relational framing that they are actually unable to speak much at all. Even the simple act of naming through coordination framing needs to be trained with specific procedures. So the book you can see here is centered on this topic. I recommend it if you work with people with developmental disabilities. In psychotherapy, we usually work with clients who have fairly good relational framing skills. They are able to talk and understand what others say. But in some contexts, they can struggle with certain types of framing. For example, in couples therapy, it's not rare to see someone struggle to take the perspective of his partner. In these cases, it's not that the relational framing skill is absent from his repertoire, but rather that it's lacking appropriate contextual control and flexibility. We will come back to these points in other tutorials. For now, let's just remember that relational framing is a skill and that when it is impaired, psychological problems can arise. Another area where language processes lead to psychological problems is experiential avoidance. This is a concept well known in modern CBT that we can define as the attempt to avoid or escape painful psychological experiences. Experiential avoidance per se is not necessarily problematic, but when it has an important cost, when it doesn't work, it's at the core of many psychological disorders. So let's see how RFT explains experiential avoidance. First, let's explore how language leads to experiential avoidance. We're going to take a simple example. A woman is involved in a car accident. Through classical conditioning and generalization, she may then have painful emotional reactions when she takes the same road again, or even when she takes a new car. The road And cars in general have acquired the function of triggering anxiety through direct experience, or generalization of intrinsic properties. Indeed, all cars look relatively similar, so functions can spread easily to all cars without any use of language. Even an animal without language would probably have similar reactions to the same processes of learning. However, for humans with language, we generally also observe that things that were not associated with the accident and don't share intrinsic similarities can acquire the same function as the accident. For example, the word crash might trigger anxiety even though there is nothing intrinsically similar between an actual accident and the word crash. And since words like crash can be in our thoughts, then thoughts can contain triggers of anxiety. It's not just in the situation that we'll find triggers of painful emotions, but in our minds too. And since we tend to avoid things that are painful, like we avoid touching a hot stove in order not to get burned, we end up avoiding thoughts that contain symbols triggering painful emotions. So if you don't believe me, you can try this little exercise. Take a piece of paper and write down the name of one of the people you love the most in the world. Then, just before the name, write I hope. And then, just after the name, write will die in a horrible car crash. And now notice your reaction. When people do this exercise, very often they refuse to write the whole sentence, or if they do, they end up crossing out the sentence after, and they throw the paper away as soon as possible. Even those who don't do that often at least tell themselves something to sort of cancel what they wrote. Even though it's just some ink on a piece of paper, it's hard not to feel something painful. And nobody wants to feel something painful, of course. So if we look at RFT data on this topic, we can mention the great work done by Simon Diamond and Brian Roche in particular. With other colleagues, they conducted experiments in which a neutral picture, like a blue triangle, was associated with scary pictures and sounds on a computer. Then the participants learned that they could press the space bar of the keyboard each time they would see the blue triangle on the screen, and this way the scary pictures and sounds would not be displayed. So, in other words, they could avoid the scary pictures and sounds. In the test phase, the researchers observed that the participants pressed the spacebar each time they saw the blue triangle, but also the red cross and the green square, which had been put in relation of equivalence through a previous training phase, in a way similar to what we saw in the last tutorial. So it means that through language, the target of avoidance generalized to things that had not been associated to the scary pictures and sounds, and that did not have intrinsic similarities with the sound and picture, and not even with the blue triangle. So this experiment thus reproduces what happened to the woman in the car accident. All kinds of experiences can evoke painful emotions through the process of symbolic generalization. And so we can avoid all kinds of things even if they are not intrinsically painful. So we saw that language can lead to experiential avoidance. Now let's consider an interesting paradox. Language actually also interferes with the success of experiential avoidance. When we try to do it, it generally doesn't work for the same reasons we actually try to do it. So it's like the Danaid myth, where trying to fill a jar with water never works because there is a hole in the jar. That's an endless job. Let's see how RFT studied this issue. Nick Hooper and his colleagues did a great study that has been cited a number of times because it's really perfect to explain the paradox of experiential avoidance. The first phase of the experiment consisted of training participants to relate the word bear in equivalence with the non-words bosim and jedir. The principle was the same as what we saw in the previous tutorial with the red cross, the green square, and the blue triangle. There was some direct training and some derived learning, as you can see with the different colors on the arrows. In the second phase, the participants saw on a computer screen different non-words appear for a few seconds each, among which there were the non-words bosim and jedir and the word bear. Some participants were asked not to think of a bear as they were watching the words and the non-words on the screen. So as you can imagine, it's hard not to think of a bear if you see the word bear on the screen. So the participants were allowed to remove any word from the screen by pressing the spacebar. For other participants, the instruction was to press the spacebar every time they saw the word bear, but they were not asked to think not to think of a bear. So the results showed that in both groups, they quickly removed the word bear each time they saw it on the screen. What was also observed was that the participants who were asked not to think of a bear also removed quickly the non-words bosim and jedir that were in relation of equivalence through relational framing. Whereas in the other group, where participants were only asked to remove the word bear from the screen, the words jedir and bosim were left there like any other words and non-words. So what it means is that when participants were asked not to think of a bear, they had to remove anything that could remind them of a bear. The word bear, but also the non-words bosim and jedir that had now become symbols for bear. So in other words, it means that when we want to get rid of an emotion, we have to get rid of everything that can evoke it. And because of symbolic generalization, the number of things that can evoke this emotion is limitless. Let's look at an example in a more clinical context. Imagine a client suffering from obsessions linked to contamination. Typically, a person suffering from this kind of fear will avoid thoughts like contamination, viruses, but also bacteria, germs, and even things that in theory shouldn't trigger fear because it is opposed to contamination, like doctors or shower. But even when things are in relation of opposition, they can still evoke similar emotions because there is a connection. It's like the typical example of someone crying at a party because it reminds her of someone she lost and who is not there with her at the party. So avoiding psychological experiences is made, if not impossible, at least very difficult and costly because we have to focus all our efforts on avoiding. And in the meantime, we miss other important things in our lives. The reason why it's so important to talk about experiential avoidance is that it's involved in many psychological problems. In fact, a lot of researchers now think that it's a trans-DSM diagnostic process, which means that it is at the core of disorders that, from a DSM perspective, are distinct from each other, but that perhaps have more in common than we might think. Anxiety disorders, addictions, depression, psychosis, and many others are correlated with measures of experiential avoidance. Let's now talk about a third kind of problems that can be caused by language processes, the problems linked to rule following and ineffective persistence. This kind of problem corresponds to situations in which clients persist in strategies because they believe it is the right thing to do, even though it actually doesn't work, and it can even make things worse. What often happens in these cases is that rules, which, as we saw in a previous tutorial, define behaviors and their consequences, create insensitivity to important elements of the context. It's like this character here who doesn't see that there is another way to escape danger than persisting in trying to open the door even though it's closed. Just because it's written exit on the door, the open window nearby becomes like invisible to him. There's a famous experiment on this topic that was conducted in the 80s, right before RFT was officially named, but that came out of the lab of researchers that later developed RFT. In this experiment, participants are presented with two buttons that they need to press in order to earn points. The buttons are alternately activated, so when the green button is activated, the participants need to press the green button, and the same thing for the red button. And the buttons are not exactly the same. On the green button, you need to press once every 10 seconds on average to earn 1 point, whereas on the red button, you need to press 10 times on average to earn 1 point. So logically, to earn as many points as possible, it's better to press very fast on the red button, whereas on the green button, you can press just once every 10 seconds, on average. The participants were then divided in two groups. In one group, the participants were given the instruction of pressing fast on the red button and slow on the green button in order to earn as many points as possible. In the other group, the participants didn't receive any instructions except for doing the best that they can to earn as many points as possible. So as you can imagine, the participants who received the instructions were able to adjust their responses more quickly than the participants who had to figure out on their own what the best strategy was. But after all participants were able to respond in the most appropriate way, the consequences were switched between the two buttons without telling the participants. So it means that now it was best to press fast on the green button and slow on the red button. What was observed then was that the participants who received the instructions in the first phase took more time to adapt to the new consequences than the participants who learned by themselves what the best strategy was. In other words, rule following helps to learn faster, but we become insensitive to changing contingencies. We become rigid. So persisting in strategies that are not working is almost a defining feature of psychological problems if we think about it. Probably most clients we see in therapy are doing things that are not working and keep doing these things even though they are not working. This is probably in part why many people persist in experiential avoidance even if it's not working. There are so many explicit and implicit rules in our cultures about emotional control that it's not surprising to see people persisting in this strategy despite its cost and ineffectiveness. So here's a summary of the main points you've learned in this tutorial and that I encourage you to remember. Psychological problems can be caused by a lack of relational flexibility and fluency. Language can lead to experiential avoidance due to symbolic generalization. Language, paradoxically, interferes with the success of experiential avoidance also due to symbolic generalization. Experiential avoidance is at the core of a number of psychological problems. Language can lead to persistence in ineffective strategies through the process of rule following. And persistence in ineffective strategies is involved in most psychological problems. So this is the end of this tutorial on language and psychopathology. This tutorial was adapted from the first part of Chapter 2 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. If you want to watch the next tutorial on language and psychopathology with problems linked to sense-making and motivation, you can go to languageasintervention.com. You will also find other resources on the applications of RST for clinical practice.